Because if we don't tell our own stories, if we don't analyze ourselves, if we don't deal with our own trauma, no one's going to help us. And that's why the act of storytelling, I think, is so crucial to survival in this country.
Familia, welcome back to season 2 of Nilk's Freedom to Thrive podcast. Resistance, justice, resilience. Where we have beautiful conversations with beautiful folks about how to survive, thrive, and fight back in these times. And me, I'm your host, Hector Flores. Let's get to the show. Today, we get the chance to talk to two amazing individuals. First is the multi-dimensional Pulitzer Prize winning Vietnamese American novelist, essayist, executive producer, and homie's also professor, Viet Nguyen, that we're going to bring onto the show today. Super excited to have a conversation with him. And then after him, stick around because we're going to have a wonderful conversation with Nilk's very own VP of Policy, Heidi Altman, who's going to share with us some of the work they're doing right now at the national level, fighting for immigrant rights. So stick around, familia, because it's going to be a good one. So you may have seen this guest on the Seth Meyers show. You may have read one of his numerous fiction, nonfiction books. He has a memoir out, writing short stories, children's books. And if you've had the good fortune being one of his classes, because this professor is also teaching everywhere you go. He's on podcasts, he's in the classroom, he's in the streets, he's in the writing room. This man is a jack of all trades. And so can we give a big round of applause for Viet Nguyen? Gracias for joining the podcast.
Hi, Hector. It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Hey, look, and of course you would be in front of 1 million books.
Well, this is Hollywood, so they're all fake. That's the first thing to know.
That's what yeah. I like you already. Hey, we have not formally met, but I know of your work and I'm excited for this conversation. Thank you for joining us. Because this organization, the National Immigration Law Center, is doing amazing work. And what we're trying to also build up and elevate is the writers, the comedians, the thinkers who are doing work, not just in the courtroom, but in society and in the classroom. And brother, you're one of them.
Well,
So I want to
not to
begin.
toot my own horn, but every category that you mentioned is absolutely crucial in many kinds of fights for social justice that we're having, because the struggle is not only in the courtroom and on the streets, as you're saying very accurately, but the struggle is also about the narrative, the story. And so we need the actors and the comedians and the writers and the storytellers to advocate for the kind of country, the kind of society that we want.
That's what I'm talking about. And so you are a Pulitzer Prize award-winning author, but I don't want to begin there because your story does not begin there, right? I actually want to begin with your origin story, right? And so and before that, I want to share is I was born in East LA, but I also grew up in a bunch of neighborhoods in the San Gabriel Valley. So if people don't know, the San Gabriel Valley is just east of East LA, and it's actually a Pan-Asian, Chicano, Latino neighborhood. So I grew up with Vietnamese homies, Filipino families, Chinese neighbors. And so there was a lot of unity and at the same time, a lot of division between communities based on your accent, based on class, based on income, based on what neighborhood you lived in. If you lived in Almani or if you lived in Rosemead or if you lived in Alhambra, right? And all that ultimately shaped who we were, right? And so my question to you, Brother Viet, is one, what is your origin story? And how did growing up in San Jose in the Bay Area shape your identity and who you became?
I mean, first of all, I love that you described San Gabriel Valley as east of East LA. That's a title of something. I don't know if it's a TV series or a novel or a memoir. It's a great description. But, my origin story is that I was born in Vietnam and I came as a refugee to the United States in 1975. Your audience probably knows there was an American war in Vietnam, a very complicated thing that revealed many of the contradictions of the United States. I just want to share an anecdote. I was just in Puerto Rico for 10 days, and the man living next to me in my Airbnb was an 81-year-old veteran of the U.S. military who had been drafted in the 1960s, and he went to Germany, lucky for him, but his brother went to Vietnam. And I told him, hey, we're on the island of Vieques, and the U.S. military tested weapons here for 40 years. And he said, that's right. They were testing weapons to kill your people. And my neighbor was like, I'm a black man in Puerto Rico, and I'm being drafted into the US military to go, support this war effort, even though my island is colonized. These are the words that he used, and being used as a military testing ground. So this is part of where I come in as a refugee. I talk a lot about how I'm a refugee and not an immigrant. I think it's a very important distinction to draw, particularly because you are the National Immigration Law Center that covers a lot of different categories. But refugees are, oftentimes born out of war, out of disasters. And in many cases, at least in the United States, the US was responsible, or at least implicated in some of those things, including the war in Vietnam. So we came as refugees in 1975. And of course, the way that our narratives are often made, both by ourselves as Vietnamese people, but also by Americans as a whole, is that we came to pursue the American dream, which was the furthest thing from my parents' minds. They wanted to survive. They certainly wanted to come to the United States because they thought it was better than being in communist controlled Vietnam. But our own experiences in this country in those early years in Pennsylvania and then in San Jose, California, were difficult ones. And what you described in San Gabriel Valley was pretty much what I experienced growing up in San Jose. I grew up next to the freeway. I grew up in working class downtown San Jose. It was full of Vietnamese people, white working class people, Mexicans, and maybe other Latinos. I'm not totally sure. And I think that's fair for me to say because my Mexican friends called me Chino. And I was like, okay, I know that's not an insult, but we all look the same, and maybe a little bit on the vice versa side too. But we form communities, we form bonds, but there are also those tensions that you describe between many different communities, but also within the community. So downtown San Jose in the 1970s and 1980s was a difficult, rough, violent place, especially if you were a refugee and an immigrant. And oftentimes the violence was not simply between groups, but within groups. My parents ran a Vietnamese grocery store. That's how they made their living. That's how they tried to find their American story. But they were shot in their store on Christmas Eve when I was 9 years old. We were robbed at gunpoint in our house by a white guy when I was 16 years old. We were terrified of other Vietnamese people because they were part of the whole gangster wave that was part of the consequences of being refugees fleeing from a war. And all those things constituted what it meant to be an immigrant and a refugee in San Jose, California in the 70s and the 80s. But I felt very lucky to grow up there and then to go to school at UC Berkeley in the Bay Area, because you know as well as I do that California is great. It's its own country. So it has all the ups and all the downs and all the unevennesses of any country. But there were so many beautiful things about growing up in the Bay Area, not the least of which was the fact that that was an immigrant area. And we all benefited, those of us who lived there, from what immigrants brought, what immigrants and refugees brought in terms of their work ethic, but also their cultural heritages, their food, their languages. And that whole environment of diversity completely shaped who I was.
A question I have for you is something that a lot of Latinos face, especially a lot of Latino immigrant families and children of immigrants, is this idea that we call ni de aquí, ni de allá, which means I'm not from here and I'm not from there, right? Like I'm not American enough. They don't see me as American. I don't feel American, but I'm also not Mexican. If I go back to Mexico, man, they call me Pocho, which means like you're fake Mexican, right? And those ultimately shaped who I was as a young person, and I struggled a lot. That tension of like not feeling like home. Did you feel that, and how did you deal with that as a young person, as a young adult?
I've read a novel called Pocho, as a matter of fact, and what you described is very common for so many different immigrants, refugees, minorities, people of color in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois characterized Black experience as being one of double consciousness in the late 19th century, and that whole idea of duality, of being split, of being torn apart, is so common. Now, the key thing I want to stress here is that what we're talking about is often discussed in the United States and in other countries that I'm familiar with, like France, that has other kinds of immigration and refugee and colonization issues to deal with. And it's often discussed as a problem of cultural conflict and generational conflict and identity conflict. And it is all of those things, but none of those things would exist if it wasn't for violence, if it wasn't for war and colonization and invasion and genocide and all these things. And I think that's so important to stress because I meet so many people, young people today, who are going through what I went through when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, and what my professors at Berkeley had gone through when they were students in the 1960s. The generational identity conflicts, the the conflict between East and West or North and South, that hasn't gone away. And the reason it hasn't gone away is because of the history of war and colonization and genocide. Now, if we treat these kinds of issues as identity issues, as cultural issues, then we're constantly surprised that the generation before dealt with them, our generation deals with them, our kids and our grandkids will deal with them, and we will never have the answers if we keep thinking it's only an issue of culture. It's an issue of culture only because invasions and colonization have taken place. So what does that mean? It means that I had those experiences, and in fact, the opening line of my novel, The Sympathizer, is, "I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces." That's about an actual spy, but I drew that line from my own experiences growing up as a refugee, feeling like I was a spy in the United States, feeling like I was a spook or a ghost that white people would see right through. And so that experience was common. And my way of resolving that is to, number one, constantly talk about the politics, because Americans don't want to talk about the politics. They want to talk about things like food, like, oh, if everybody can eat like a taco or a banh mi, then we should all be good. Or if we can have, even better, Korean barbecue tacos, we really got it made, because it means that we're bringing all these different cultures together. That has never solved anything. And the reason it hasn't solved anything is because of the underlying structural issues of violence and inequality and exploitation. So that's the number one thing we have to draw. The other issue, though, is also just as important, and that is neither here nor the other. Oftentimes the response is, well, I have to choose a side. I have to pick one or the other. And I have to believe in my own authenticity, in my own origins. So I have to be authentically Mexican or to be authentically Vietnamese, I have to do X, Y, or Z. And I've seen these debates playing out in Mexican-American culture, like, do you speak Spanish? Do you not speak Spanish? What kind of Spanish do you speak? Blah, blah, blah. And Vietnamese people do the same things. This is a losing battle because you can never be authentic enough. My lesson after growing up in San Jose, and I was called a whitewash, I was called a banana, and, other Vietnamese people thought I was totally Americanized. I came out of that not with a desire to be more Vietnamese, but with a recognition that authenticity is problematic, because the more we hang on to our authenticity and our origins, it might make us feel good. It might lead to better Vietnamese food or better Mexican food. But the consequence is that we will always need the outsider, the pocho or the banana, right? At a cultural level, it's not such a big deal. But the connection between that and demonizing people for their inauthenticity, demonizing people for their otherness, that has real violent consequences. That is why the Trump administration is calling, or Donald Trump himself is calling, Somalis garbage. And before that, it was the Venezuelans, or now it's still the Venezuelans. And so even though he's taking it to an incredible extreme, that impulse to define identity authentically, like American identity is this, and if you're not this, then you're the outsider. That is essentially what we ourselves as minorities do to each other as well.
Yeah. It's like a purity test, right? That's fake. That doesn't even exist. And we hold people to purity, like 100%. Something I always hear a lot of folks say, I'm 100% Mexican. You know what that means? I'm 100% mixed, right? But the idea of like, oh, there's 100% purity test that we hold against each other. And that happens a lot. And that's the divisions that we create.
Even when you
you gave me a lot to think about right now.
But even when you bring up 100% Mexican, I thought the next step you were going to go would be like, well, what does that even mean? What does 100% Mexican mean? Like, I grew up with my parents telling me, you're 100% Vietnamese. I was like, oh, okay, that what does that even mean? Like, we're 100% Vietnamese. But the moment my parents got their citizenship, they changed their names. These people who believe in themselves so strongly as Vietnamese people immediately call themselves Joseph and Linda after their citizenship. And they said to me, do you want an American name? And I'm like, Troy? No, it didn't work. So I was like, you told me I was 100% Vietnamese, so I'm going to keep my Vietnamese name. But, we came from a region of North Vietnam that was pretty close to China. So the chances of me having at least some Chinese ancestry is probably 100%. So the whole idea of being 100% Vietnamese or Mexican is a fiction, because it erases all kinds of complicated histories. Like, if you're Mexican, you're probably got you have indigenous ancestry in there somewhere. You have Spanish ancestry, definitely. So how do we even categorize all those kinds of things? So the language of purity, like you said, or the language of 100% is a total fiction, because all it does is affirm what we think of ourselves today. but it involves both remembering very selectively who we are, but forgetting a lot of things as well. And whether you're Vietnamese or Mexican or American, it's the same process. These national cultural identities, they're about remembering certain things and forgetting other things, which can be kind of fun. But when they're mixed in with violence, they become extremely dangerous. And again, that's what
Yeah.
we're seeing today. The United States,
Yeah.
according to MAGA, is white nationalist Christian, male, heteropatriarchal, heteronormative. If you're not those things, you're not authentically American, and now you're a target for all kinds of violence.
Yeah. You know, speaking of remembering, here's something I want to ask you, and I want to connect it to a story of my mother. My mother came to this country when she was 14 years old. She was the oldest of seven, and when she came to this country, her family was split up into they went to foster care. And she, fortunately, she actually had a really caring foster parents who were very supportive of her in high school and then into after high school. That impacted her so much that she actually became a foster care parent herself, right? Caring for others. And even when I was a kid, we always had people in our house. We always had people who were not our cousins who were like staying at our house because my mother, she was taken care of, and that foster care experience sort of like impacted her. My question to you is there experience that you had as a young person that inspired you or motivated you to use writing as an expression and ultimately led to you becoming a writer and a novelist?
I think my entire childhood was like that. But when we first came to the United States, we ended up in a refugee camp. So there were like 4 refugee camps throughout the country set up to hold Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao, Hmong refugees. Ours was in Fort Indian Town Gap, Pennsylvania. And in order to leave one of these camps, you had to have an American sponsor you. So there wasn't
Yeah.
an American willing to sponsor all 4 of us in my family. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. So I was separated from my parents at 4 years of age, and for good reasons. That would the ambition. The idea was to give my parents time to get on their feet and take care of their kids. But when you're 4 years of age, you don't understand that, obviously. So I thought of it, I think, as abandonment. I just remember my first memories were howling and screaming as I was taken away from my parents. And I didn't get to come home for a few months, but it felt like a very long time. My brother, who was 10, didn't come home for 2 years. So I think we've obviously been indelibly marked by that. I'm not sure what that did to my brother. It probably gave him a tremendous sense of motivation because he went to Harvard 6 years after that experience. For me, I think that experience was much more emotionally devastating than I ever realized. And the reason why I never thought it was emotionally devastating was because I grew up among Vietnamese refugees. Everybody who's a refugee who has come to the United States, Vietnamese or otherwise, has a terrible story. We've all been through something horrifying to get to this country. And so I grew up aware of that for Vietnamese refugees. And I thought, well, I was separated from my parents for a few months. That's nothing compared to what some of these people I know have gone through. And so that's why I think so many Vietnamese refugees, we never talk about our past. Like we don't really compare notes like my trauma versus your trauma, because everybody's been traumatized in one way or another. And everybody just has to move forward. And not look back. If you don't move forward, if you do look back, you're going to be trapped in some way. And so that has happened to Vietnamese refugees that I know. And so in order to survive in this country, so many of us had to simply look forward and try not to think about the past. And the consequences are devastating because there is so much unprocessed trauma in the Vietnamese refugee community. I'm sure it's true for other refugee communities as well. We didn't have the language that Americans did. We never heard of PTSD, which was a term invented to describe what American veterans of the Vietnam War went through. But whatever American veterans of the Vietnam War went through, I'll guarantee you that the average Vietnamese person had it pretty much just as bad. But we were never analyzed for that kind of thing. And so, like everybody else in my community, I just looked forward. And only because I became a writer, and I never went to therapy, but I work out my issues through my writing. I think I gradually understood, but it took me 30 or 40 years. It took me 30 or 40 years to understand that, being abandoned when you're 4 years, 4 years old can really mess you up. And the way that I dealt with that was to just shut down emotionally and just not have very good emotional relationships with anybody in my life, really. And that is a real consequence of the refugee experience, for at least for me. And I talk about this because, in its own small way, I think it helps to illuminate what so many people have gone through, and that's simply because people look okay on the surface doesn't mean they actually are. So you could look at the Vietnamese American community and think, oh, we've become pretty successful. If you look at Little Saigon and all these neighborhoods that we've built, and we look at success stories like myself or my brother or my parents, everything must be okay. But I grew up in a refugee community that was so saturated with violence, with trauma, with anger,
Mhm.
with bitterness, with domestic violence, with all kinds of terrible things. And they were all direct consequences of the war, the refugee experience, people not dealing with their issues, and so on. And so that's another reason why the act of storytelling becomes so crucial, not simply to fight back against abusive power like we're confronting now, but to confront ourselves and everything that we've been through as refugees and as immigrants. Because if we don't tell our own stories, if we don't analyze ourselves, if we don't deal with our own trauma, no one's going to help us. And that's why the act of storytelling, I think, is so crucial to survival in this country, both as a means of fighting back against abuse, but also as a means of dealing with ourselves.
I know there's that quote you just made me think of. It says, "Until lions write books, history will glorify the hunter," right?
Chinua
Which is an
Achebe.
African
Yeah,
proverb,
Chinua
you
Achebe.
know. And so, and then it makes me think you wrote a memoir, and for folks who have not read your memoir, are these the kind of themes that you explore in your memoir? What is the stories you were trying to share from your perspective in your writing in that?
Well, it's called A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial. And let me say first off, I didn't want to write a memoir.
Mm.
And if you ever meet a person who wants to write a memoir, you should run in the opposite direction, because the only people who should write memoirs are the ones who don't want to write memoirs. And in order to write a memoir, I think either number one, you're a politician, you're a celebrity, you want to sell something, or you've had some kind of terrible experience. So no one should want to write a memoir. And so I was a very reluctant memoirist, and partly because I thought my parents had been through real drama, real history, 40 years of war, famine, colonialism, refugee experiences, and so on. I was just an eyewitness to them, who were the actual eyewitnesses of history. But thinking back about what my family had been through, I realized no one else is going to tell my parents' story but me. And I would have to tell my own story as well in order to cope with everything I'd been through, to deal with the trauma that my parents underwent. My mother, for example, uh, ended up going to the psychiatric hospital a few times and was basically mentally incapacitated for the last 10, 13 years of her life. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand whether that was simply her individual fate or whether that was the consequence of all the horrible history that she had gone through. And the power of my mother's story, the reason why I wanted to write about it and its influence on me, is that, of course, she's my mother and she's an enormously important individual to me. But I also thought that she was like thousands of other people, thousands of other women who'd been through the exact same circumstances and whose stories would never be told. And it's not that it makes my mother's story less to think that her story is like a thousand others. It actually makes it more powerful, I think, because
Yeah.
what it indicates is all of these people who've been through war and refugee and colonization and so on, refugee experience, they've been shaped by history. And so the fact that their stories kind of tend to look alike in all the trauma that they've gone through and the suffering that they've experienced, that's powerful. And it needs to be acknowledged. So the memoir is a memoir not just about myself, but about my parents and about the countries I've lived in, Vietnam and the United States. And if you come to the memoir thinking here's somebody who's going to tell their American dream success story, which is typically how the so-called ethnic memoir works, you're in for a rude shock, because the story is also a deep critique of Vietnam and especially the United States. I'll just give you a glimpse of that, which is I mentioned that we ended up in Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and for 40 years of my life I never thought twice about why that fort was called what it was. But of course, it was called what it was is because in Pennsylvania, that was where the white settlers built a fort in order to conquer the land and to kill Indians. And I was so Americanized, and I don't think I was unusual in this. I was so Americanized, I never thought twice about Indiantown Gap. And that's what it means to come to this country and become an American, even if you're a refugee fleeing from somewhere else, whether it's Latin America or whether it's Southeast Asia. You become seduced by the power of American mythology, American storytelling. You forget all the things that this country wants you to forget. You forget what this country has done to indigenous peoples and to black people, and you forget what this country has done to the country you came from,
Yeah.
oftentimes. And so, you know, on the one hand, the memoir is about being a refugee and all that means in terms of the contradictions of coming to the United States from an American war, but it's also a meditation on what it means to become an American and to forget like other Americans have forgotten.
Yeah. You know, are you familiar, because you went to Berkeley, are
Yep.
you familiar with the author and activist Betita Martinez?
I am going to confess that I am not. Please school me
Oh,
on
good.
this.
It's
Yeah.
okay. It's okay. She wrote a book called De Colores and 500 Years of Chicana History, but she was the only Chicana member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she has done so many things in her lives, but she was also the first Chicana to go to Vietnam in solidarity with the Vietnamese people and in protest. At that time, she gave us, when I was an organizer in East LA, she came to our organization to share lessons of the movement that she had learned over 40 years. My brother, who was also an organizer, was about to go on a year-long journey, and he just wanted to buy a one-way ticket. And he went to Betita after her sharing and said, Betita, in all your life, from every place you've been, is there any place you would want to go if you had the opportunity to go back? She didn't even blink, Viet. She said, Vietnam. An 80-year-old woman said, I would go back to Vietnam. The people, the culture, the resilience. And so what my brother do? He bought a ticket to Vietnam. And I went out there and I met up with him. And so when we went to Hanoi. We bought 2 motorbikes and we went for a month down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? And it was an amazing trip, one of the most impactful trips of my life, because one of the things I learned about that trip was also how the United States wanted one of its most important weapons, right? And the way it tries to control territory and countries is to control the narrative. Because when I was in Vietnam, I learned really quick that they don't call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War, or they call it the American invasion. And I learned, even to this day, landmines are all throughout the country that still exist there. Hundreds of people still die from landmines that have been left in that country. But I learned that more than the controlling the resources, the U.S. wants to control the narrative, right? The story, right? And I feel like that's something I learned in my trip out there. And what you're trying to do right now, right? With your memoir and with your stories, right? What do you feel are the limits as well as the power of telling our stories right now in these times against authoritarianism?
So I, for example, teach a class on the Vietnam War at the University of Southern California to 150 students. And, you know, it's very important for me to teach the history of this war and the culture and the politics through the lens of everything we've been talking about, the multiculturalism, the diversity, the imperialism, and so on, because Americans as a whole, when they think about the Vietnam War, think about it through an American point of view. This is an American war, not a Vietnamese war. And so when it's an American war, it's very different than what you've described. When the Vietnamese call it an American war, what they're saying is, as you've mentioned, that the Americans came and took over and they had to be, defeated and evicted. But when Americans think of the Vietnam War as an American war, what Americans think of is that this is a war that's centered on American experiences. And the Americans were the victims here. Like 58,000 Americans died. The country was divided culturally and politically. That's what obsesses Americans, not the 3 million Vietnamese who died, not the hundreds of thousands of Laotians and Cambodians and Hmong who died, not the Cambodian genocide that took place immediately afterward as a consequence of American bombing and so on. And so it's very important for me to teach this story in this way. And that would include, from the American perspective, what you just described. I have a whole unit on La Raza and the Chicano moratorium and the presence of Chicano soldiers and other non-white soldiers in the American military. And my students have never heard any of these kinds of things before. They probably never heard of SNCC before, much less a Chicana member of SNCC, for example. But we get into a lot of these kinds of issues. So there's so much education that needs to be undertaken through storytelling, whether we're doing wherever we're doing our storytelling, whether we're doing it as activists and lawyers or whether we're doing it as writers and teachers. And the storytelling becomes really crucial because in that class, but in general, there are ideas, there's arguments, but the way that people remember these ideas and arguments, the way that they're persuaded is through stories. So it's our obligation, whatever role we're in, to not simply transmit facts or even arguments, but to figure out how to put them in the context of stories. Because the thing about MAGA and about Donald Trump is that he's a great storyteller. You may not like the story, but it's a great story. Okay. And the only way to fight back is to have a better story, a more compelling story, a more entertaining story, a more provocative story. And so I take that very seriously in my own work. Obviously as a writer, you have to tell stories, but as a teacher, you have to tell stories as well. In order to tell those stories, however, you have to understand what the dominant story is. If you don't understand what the dominant story is, then you simply accept that story as a fact. Now, that's extremely dangerous because if you accept something as a fact, you don't understand that, in fact, it's an interpretation. So you brought up the example of you and your brother going to Vietnam. That's a fantastic example in the presence of, Betita Martinez in Vietnam as one of these feminist, anti-racist, anti-war, anti-imperialist activists. I know about that history. And in my turn, I feel that it's my obligation to find new stories, new interpretations that go beyond my own trauma and the trauma of the Vietnamese people. And so in February of this year, I very deliberately chose to go to El Salvador. That was my equivalent of what you did. Because, I grew up in the 1980s as a refugee from the Vietnam War, but also I was a Catholic schoolboy, and I was very aware of what was happening in Central America because it was, the civil wars, the American presence, what the United States was doing, and the consequences in terms of murders and massacres and authoritarianism, especially the things that were being done to Catholic priests and so on, and Catholic nuns in El Salvador. So that always kind of stayed with me, and I wanted to figure out more about that. And I got a chance to go in February. And the reason why it's important, besides my own personal investment, is that the moment that the United States finished in Southeast Asia or was defeated, it immediately turned its attention to Central America. And so there's a complete connection between the American war in Vietnam and the American-sponsored wars in El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so on. Yeah. And most Americans have no idea. They have no idea, number one, that these things happened in Central America. And they absolutely have no idea that there's a connection between the United States fighting these wars in Southeast Asia and the United States turning towards Central America and doing the same thing. And so it's not enough, going back to the authenticity narrative, it's not enough to tell our own story, because the temptation is we will always think of ourselves as victims. And when we think of ourselves as victims, it lets us off the hook. We may indeed be victims, but maybe we're victimizers too. That's the next step that a lot of people don't want to make. They want to focus on how something terrible has been done to them, which it may be, but then they don't think about how that justifies them doing terrible things to other people. That's what the United States did after 9/11. That's what Israel is doing to Palestine and to Gaza and to Palestinians. And those of us who are minorities and who are oppressed, it's too easy to just simply tell our own story. We have to do what you did. Go to Vietnam, see something that decenters us. Me going to El Salvador decenters me. But it allows me to connect Vietnam to El Salvador to the United States. That's an important political move. That's an important move in terms of storytelling for myself and for me to understand the United States and to tell a more complicated story about the United States. But it's also an important move simply as a human being to recognize the fact that we're not unique in our victimization. We may even be complicit in the victimization of other people, which is generally very true for Americans as a whole.
And then, I don't know, it's kind of amazing because one, you're talking to me like a professor right now. I feel like I'm a student and I'm in your classroom right now and I'm eating it all up. And I mean, you wrote a novel about a half French, half Vietnamese spy, right? And that novel was so good, it got you the Pulitzer Prize, and it was turned into HBO series. Um, Not everybody has seen it. Can you give the premise a little bit for folks who haven't seen it? Because you talked a little bit about it before, but I want to sort of kind of go back and give the premise for folks who have not seen or read the book, because I think that it entails a lot of what you're talking about now and how you converted that into a story.
So the Sympathizer is a novel about this half French, half Vietnamese spy who's a communist, a secret communist, but he's embedded in the South Vietnamese army, which is an anti-communist army. And that army gets defeated in 1975, and many of these soldiers flee to the United States. And our spy's mission is to flee with them and to spy on their efforts to take their country back. Now, this sounds like fiction, but it's all true. I mean, I grew up in this Vietnamese refugee community, and there really was an effort in the 70s and 80s to sponsor this sort of counter-revolutionary effort taking place in Thailand. And the idea was that I heard these rumors that if, the most famous pho restaurant, and you may know what pho is the famous Vietnamese soup and so on, was funneling money to these guerrillas in Thailand. And that I never forgot that story. But there were so many other stories like this in the Vietnamese refugee community that the rest of the United States has no idea about. So 95% of the Sympathizer, the incidents that happen in that book, are real or based on something that really happened. So it is a book that would teach you about, the Vietnam War from Vietnamese points of view, but it's also a spy novel because it's meant to be entertaining. And I chose the spy genre because spy novels, when they're done right, entertain us, but they also talk a lot about politics and history and war as well. And so, yeah, it was actually a lot of fun to write. It was the novel that really allowed me to get a lot of things off my chest. I went to Berkeley and I immediately became a radicalized, angry Asian American. And it took me about 20 years to develop the literary chops in order to write a novel that could adequately express the anger in an entertaining way, but also in a funny way. So, there's a lot of jokes in that book. And, those of us who've been through traumatic experiences, or those of us who are part of minority communities, I think we all should be aware that our survival is not merely economic, it's not merely political or cultural. It's oftentimes also based in humor. We have to tell jokes to survive. We have to tell jokes about ourselves. We have to tell jokes about dominant power, about white people. We have to tell jokes about the most tragic and horrible things that have happened, because we have to be able to laugh at these things, number one, to help us cope, but number two, to help us make fun of the people in power. And so that's why one of the most important tools that we have today in our fight against, the Trump administration is humor. We have to make fun of these people because they're idiots. They're powerful, dangerous idiots, but they're still idiots. And so that's absurd. And, when you're confronted with absurdity, you have to respond with absurdity as well. And so there's a lot of that going on in The Sympathizer. And if you watch the TV series only and you don't read the book, okay, well, first of all, let me say this. If you don't read the book, that's okay, but at least buy the book and just keep it on your shelf and pretend you've read it, and then you can watch the TV series. But in the TV series, there's a lot of that absurdity and a lot of that humor as well going on. And I want to point out that that TV series, it's $135 million TV series, which is an absurd amount of money, and it's made by A24 and HBO. But almost everybody who's involved in a major way is not an American. The producer's Canadian, the co-head writer's Canadian, the co-showrunner Park Chan-wook is Korean and one of the greatest Korean directors in the world. And this is the way it should have turned out, because I knew that if I sold this novel and it was going to be made by white American guys, I would be totally screwed. They would just bring, the Ken Burns perspective to this thing. But because it was made by Canadians and by Koreans, who stand outside of the United States, it's necessary to stand outside of the United States in order to understand the weirdnesses and the absurdities of the United States itself. That's how I think we were able to make a TV series that was both entertaining, but also hopefully politically provocative as well.
Viet, what is your call out to artists and writers in this time to create hope in this time? What gives you hope? Let me rephrase the question. What gives you hope in these times, Viet? And what is your call out to storytellers and artists right now?
Well, I think it takes a lot of courage to be an artist. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. I just think that's a statement of fact. We live in a society that doesn't reward the arts, that, we live in a society that privileges these gross acts of materialism and greed and vanity and power and abuse. And the arts could do those kinds of things, but most often the arts are about telling genuinely human, empathetic stories. And that takes courage to do that for a couple of reasons, because we live in a society that doesn't reward that, but also because if you want to be able to tell these genuinely human and empathetic stories, you have to cut into yourself. I mean, you can come up with a spy story and make it entertaining, but the emotions have to come from within the writer or
Yeah.
within the artist. And so the only way to access those emotions is to cut within yourself and to look into the dark parts of yourself, what I call the trap door. You have to lift the trap door that you're standing on, that you want to keep shut, because underneath are all the things that horrify and terrify you, all the ghosts of your childhood, all the demons and so on. And most people reasonably want to keep that door shut, whether as individuals or as members of a nation. Like the United States as a whole is standing on a trap door, and beneath it are all the horrors of genocide and colonization and enslavement and brutality, all the things that contradict what Americans think of themselves. But we as individuals stand on those trapdoors of the things that contradict us as well. So to be an artist requires courage, because you have to forge your own career and your vocation in the face of skepticism, but you have to open the trapdoor. The trapdoor of your own soul, the trapdoor of the country, the trapdoor of your community. You have to talk about things that your family doesn't want you to talk about, your community doesn't want you to talk about, that the country doesn't want you to talk about. But you have to talk about those things, because those are the things that matter. The things that people don't want to talk about are the things that matter. And it takes courage to confront yourself and to confront those kinds of issues. And of course, all of us who come from communities that have been minoritized and colonized in some ways, we know what those stories probably are. But there's always a moment when you're tempted into silence. And for me, of course, in the last few years, that was Gaza. That was the genocide in Gaza. That was October 7th. And I felt that I had to speak out about those kinds of things. And I paid a small price for that. Many people paid larger prices. But the thing is that so many people were silent on this issue. And now more and more people are finally starting to speak up. And they're doing that because there were people who were willing to speak up before them, beginning with Palestinians, beginning with anti-Zionist Jews. And so I find some despair in the fact that so many people were silent for so long on that issue or other issues. But I find hope that eventually that people did speak, and that more people are speaking out. And I'm going to leave you with the words that have inspired me. When I think about how to respond in principle to all of your questions, like why do we do what we do as immigrant advocates, as lawyers, as activists, as writers, and so on? I don't think the answer is because we want to stand up for our people. That's a secondary answer. Of course, we want to stand up for our family, our friends, our loved ones, our communities, our people. But the first answer, the most important answer, is that we have to stand up for those who are oppressed. That's the core issue. And the reason why it's a core issue is because sometimes we're the oppressed and sometimes we're the oppressor. And if we don't understand that, we become the oppressor really, really easily. That's why Trump was able to seduce so many people, including some black people, some brown, a lot of brown people, some Asians. Like, why do these people vote for him? Because they want to side with the oppressor. They forget that they have been the oppressed themselves. And so, my moral compass, my artistic compass, my political compass is very much defined by that. Whoever is the other, whoever is the outsider, whoever is the human animal, whoever is the monster, whoever's being demonized, that's who we should stand up for. And it takes courage, but also hope to do that as well. The hope that more and more of us will join in that fight, in that necessary act of solidarity to stand up for the ones who are outcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of people who are going to listen to this podcast and then be like, I want to know more. What is, for somebody listening to this podcast who has not heard of you and your writings, what would you offer as the first book you would want them to read?
Oh, well, for sure, The Sympathizer. That's the book that's probably going to be engraved on my headstone, for better and for worse.
Okay. And so Viet, where can people find you and what's next for you?
You can find me on my website, vietnguyen.info, has all of my interviews, essays, blah, blah, blah on there, or my most popular social media profile, Instagram, viet_t_nguyen, where you'll get a lot more of the same things that you've been hearing today.
Any more series coming up? Any more books?
Well, the sequel to The Sympathizer is called The Committed. It's set in Paris. We're trying to develop a movie about that.
All right. Viet, brother, thank you so much. And now that I know you're in LA, I might look out for a phone call from your friend Hector, man.
All right, Hector. All right? We'll see you on the streets of East LA.
East LA, brother. Thank you so much, Viet. Órale. Familia, that is what you call a beautiful conversation. Gracias, Viet. Thank you so much. I feel like I I feel like I need to go and read all his books right now. He's got like 8 of them. But I love the way he talked about the power and danger of stories and storytelling, and the role that we as artists and lawyers and just everyday folks really need to start sharing our story in order to make sure that we own our narrative and we know own our own humanity. So I'm going to take that into this next conversation. I'm excited to bring on someone who's doing incredible work at the national level with NILC. She is the VP of Policy at the National Immigration Law Center. Everybody, please welcome Heidi Altman to the stage. Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thanks, Hector. I'm such a fan. Excited to be here, and my mind and heart are full from the conversation with Viet.
You know, a lot of folks, when you think of policy people at organizations, you don't always have a face. So I think one thing we want to do is, one is we want people to know you, meet you, see you, but also, how did you get into policy? Like, what can you give us one example or something that happened in the past that motivated you, inspired you to kind of get into policy work?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When I going back when I graduated from college, I wanted to do international human rights work. I found it very intellectually stimulating, and it didn't take me a long time to realize that I don't have to leave the country. We have a human rights crisis here, and it's the way our government treats immigrant communities. And what happened for me specifically is that I was doing work as a paralegal with people who had recently arrived in the United States, mostly from Central and Western Africa, and were seeking asylum here and were locked up for it in New Jersey and New York. And the experience of spending so many hours in those jails with people who had fled, such a tough decision, right? Like uprooted their lives, fled, and then they get here and they're in a jail and I'm sitting with them. It changed me forever. And I just knew that I wanted to do this work. So I've been doing immigrant justice work for about 20 years. And before I did policy work, I was a deportation defense attorney doing deportation defense, mostly for people in immigration detention and mostly for people who were both dealing with the criminal legal system and the immigration system and the racism that's inherent in both.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like same thing for me. It was after college. I wanted to make an impact in community and I fell into organizing, right? Like I didn't know what to do. I just want to know I wanted to make a change. And I was an organizer for 10 years doing educational justice work, immigrant rights work, housing justice work in East LA before I transitioned to work as an artist and musician. But I felt the same way. Like you don't have to go anywhere to be able to,
It's here.
it was right. I didn't have to leave LA. There's a lot of human rights violations and work to be done here. So I feel you on that. We heard from Viet in his sharing how stories are so powerful, right? Stories have the power to elevate, also manipulate. And my question to you is, as someone who does work in policy, like how does storytelling influence, support, or impact policy work that y'all are doing?
Yeah. My storytelling is everything. And actually, maybe I'll connect back to the beginnings of my work in this field, right? Which is that it occurred to me pretty quickly as I was spending a lot of time talking with people who were in immigration detention, that the government is telling a story by detaining people who arrive in the United States to seek asylum, right? Because when the rest of the world looks at someone in jail, there's a lot of dots that they connect. And that's exactly the story that the administration wants to tell. And I was thinking about that when Viet was talking about how hard this administration is working to control the narrative and how really talented they are at it. Our job, the policy shop at NILC, is to make sure that there's a counter narrative and to try to, in creative ways, because it really is a challenge, get our members of Congress and our elected officials and our people in positions of power to go out there and be countering that narrative and exchange humanization for dehumanization and tell the stories of their loved ones and their neighbors and their constituents who are immigrants and are so integral and vital to their communities. And that's not happening enough. So that's our job, is to push for it to happen more.
Can you share a little bit with folks what NILC is working on right now, or going to be working on the policy level, that people can learn more about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, on the policy level, we work at federal advocacy. We do a lot of advocacy with members of Congress and with their staff. And we also believe strongly that while we're holding the line at the federal level, we're also working with our partners in community who are organizing for change at the state level, because that's where some of the more exciting, innovative change can happen right now. At the federal level, we're really fighting to hold the line. We know that's what we're doing, right? We're on defense. The other component of our policy work at NILC is that we put resources out into the community. We call it our Community Empowerment Project. And we believe that there is so much power in knowledge. And so we're putting out materials. We're trying to put them out in language that is really accessible. We don't want to be wonks. We want to be writing things that people can understand, and getting that translated into the languages of the people who need the information. And then getting it into the right hands so that when ICE shows up at someone's door, they feel empowered and they've practiced and they've got that piece of paper in their hands to be able to say, you don't have a warrant, I'm not letting you in. But also so that healthcare providers know how to do that in their community health clinics, and so that teachers know how to do it in their classrooms, shelter providers know how to do it in their homelessness shelters. And so we're trying to get that material and that information out as broadly and as widely as possible. And it's really challenging at a time when we're honest about the fact that this administration is breaking the law a lot. So there are limits to knowing your rights.
Where can people get this information? Heidi, where can we go?
All this information is on our website, www.nilc.org. And we have a specific library for Know Your Rights documents. And one of the things I will say to everyone listening to this podcast is that our primary concern when we create these materials is making sure we're creating the materials that people really need. And so if you are out there in your community and you're like, I just wish I had a resource telling me X, please let us know. We want to hear it. One of the recent resources we created is about how to find a loved one if they're arrested, because we were seeing and hearing that. And as we heard from Viet, people are getting disappeared. Like, people get picked up by ICE or CBP and their family can't find them for 3-4 days. So we wanted to put something out that was step by step. Like, this is where you go. These are the different places you can look to try to identify where your loved one is. So that's an example.
Heidi, thank you so much for sharing. Gracias. My question to you, last one, is what can everyday people do who are listening to this podcast do if they want to support the work of NILC? What would you say?
There's so many ways to be part of this, actually. And it's what we need, because we're talking about storytelling, right? So we all have voices. Let's all make our voices heard. And there's a bunch of ways to do that. One thing I would say is go to our website. There are always actions, sort of the moment actions on our website that you can take by calling your member of Congress. Congress is hearing all the time from anti-immigrant voices. We hear it from staffers in these congressional offices. They're overwhelmed with phone calls from anti-immigrant hateful callers. And so we need to make sure that when they're recording those calls at the end of the day, that they're hearing from voices of people like us and our listeners who have integrity and who care and who are calling. And you can say something as basic as, hey, I'm calling because I haven't heard Senator so-and-so or Congressperson so-and-so talk about immigrants' rights in a while. And I'm hoping they can put out some tweets or make a statement on the floor of Congress talking about how important immigrants are in my community and their community. So that's one really important action. Another thing is that resistance is happening at the ground level, very, very local level, even in specific neighborhoods, not even cities. And so there is very likely a mutual aid, immigrants' rights collective happening in your neighborhood or your community. And there are so many opportunities to be standing with people who are facing immigration enforcement if you have the privilege, like me, of not facing that enforcement yourself. So a group that is a local support organization can help you figure out ways to, for example, accompany people to their immigration court hearings or accompany people to their ICE check-in. And sometimes you just being there, the community showing up is enough to deter ICE from detaining that person. And if it's not enough, then you're there to bear witness. And then you have a story to tell and go out and report out, right? What you saw. Tell your member of Congress about what you saw. Tell the local press about what you saw. Those stories are so powerful now. They're what we need.
Yeah. I'm seeing people organize across the country at their local Home Depots, right?
Yeah.
Making sure that they're safe for people to work there, to show up there. There's all kinds of actions like that. I thank you so much for saying that, because, and even calling your Congress, right? Like, you don't have to just do it once when there's an action. You can actually be calling people consistently. Like,
All the
make it a
time.
Monday thing. Make it a Monday thing and be like, I haven't seen a tweet. I haven't seen a gram. I haven't seen a post. I love that. And I don't think I've seen it said like that, like just that simply. Like, we actually need to be calling more, because the anti folks are calling all the damn time.
Yeah, they're doing it.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Gracias. Heidi, thank you so much for the work. I heard your daughter's running around. I know you got to get to her right now. So thank you so much for the work you do for the country, for your family, you know what I'm saying? And as an agitator and activist. Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for your art, your work, for being here with us. It's been so much fun.
Familia, that was an amazing conversation with two amazing individuals. Thank you so much for being on this journey with us, for being part of these conversations. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to check us out on YouTube, and we'll see you at the next one. Gracias. Thanks for listening to the episode of Nilk's Freedom to Thrive podcast, Resistance, Justice, Resilience. To learn more about the work Nilk is doing, visit nilk.org, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes.